Welcome back to Almost Fiction, Part 2 of the story of the Riverside Strangler. If you haven't listened to Part 1 yet, now is the perfect time to catch up. Don't worry, I will still be here when you get back. This case, though decently well covered, would probably be even bigger, even more famous if, at the time of its trial, it wasn't overshadowed by one of the most famous court cases in American history. The trial of O.J. Simpson. And though no case is more important than another, the celebrity of one seemed to tower over and push to the side the story of the man who killed up to 20 different women for the crime of prostitution. We may never know what brought about this extremism. We may never know what, if anything, caused this man to act the way he did, taking things to the extreme while also seeking sexual gratification in the process. So, I'll let you decide. Let you try and decipher any clues that he might have left as to why he ended up the way he did. So, without further ado, I present to you Part 2 and the conclusion of the case of William Lester Suff. As always, I'm Chase Ellerman, and this is Almost Fiction. Chapter 6. November 6th, 1990. 33-year-old Cheryl Coker is found 1 week after she is last seen by her husband as she leaves for work. Her posed body had been found near Palmerita Avenue in an industrial area of Riverside by a local plant employee under a pile of tree branches next to a dumpster. The area was not too far away from where Carol Miller had also been discovered. After the autopsy, the official cause of death was listed as strangulation. On Cheryl's neck ran a single thin ligature mark deep enough to break skin. Fingernail marks were also discovered on her neck, consistent with someone trying to grab at the ligature. And due to decomposition, the examiner was unable to identify petechial hemorrhaging, but the reddish-brown color of her eyes was a strong indicator. Cheryl's left breast was then discovered 30 feet away from where her body had been. A used condom had also been discovered at the victim's feet, with semen still inside. Fibers as well as hair were also discovered on her body and collected. "27-year-old Susan Sternfeld was last seen on December 19, 1990 in the early afternoon. She was working at the time and looking for her next, quote, trick, end quote. And 2 days later, on December 21st, her nude body was found by a janitor of a local factory in an enclosure of a dumpster in the same industrial area where Cheryl Coker had been discovered. She was immediately identified by the officers who responded on scene. She was well known to police because of her many drug and prostitution arrests. Like before, the cause of death is strangulation, and like previous victims, she had been posed with her legs spread wide. Susan had hemorrhages in both of her eyes, eyelids, as well as muscles in her neck. She also had abrasions on her neck and a fracture of her larynx. Semen was collected during a vaginal swab, and fibers were collected from the scene. Chapter 7. The bodies of local sex workers seemed to almost be piling up, and as more and more women showed up strangled to death, law enforcement finally put together a task force to try and deal with the situation. Detectives from around the county began to work together in order to try and stop whoever might be behind this extreme rise in death rates surrounding the local sex industry. The task force was also given a budget as well as a space for them to work, but they still needed a few more things. Desks, file cabinets, chairs, as well as various other office supplies and equipment. So, in order to get everything they needed, detectives made their way over to the Riverside County warehouse, where they would fill out request forms. Upon their arrival, they were assisted by a stock clerk who would be able to help them with all of their acquisitions, a stock clerk named Bill Suff. Not only did Bill help investigators with their requests, but he also seemed to be quite interested in the cases they were covering, especially when it came to the victims and the potential suspects. In fact, Bill was with two investigators one morning when they got a page informing them that yet another victim had just been discovered. Before even having a chance to tell Bill, though, he looked them in the eyes and asked, quote, "Oh, did you find another body?" End quote. January 18th, 1991. 42-year-old Kathleen Puckett, a.k.a. Kathleen Leslie Milne, vanished from University Avenue, her sister, the last person to see her alive. 24 hours later, Kathleen's nude body is found 30 miles away on a dirt road northwest of Lake Elsinore by a passing motorist. She had died as a result of asphyxiation due to strangulation, as well as the obstruction of her airway by a sock that had been stuffed into her mouth. Kathleen had hemorrhages in her eyes, mouth, neck, and her larynx had been fractured. There was also evidence that before she was strangled, she had been knocked unconscious by several severe blows to the head. A vaginal swab was taken and stored. Multiple fibers were then collected from her body. Like in many other cases, tire tracks were photographed and seemed to match those taken from the Leal, Ferguson, and Miller crime scenes. The evidence was recorded and stored. By now, it was more than obvious that the task force was dealing with a serial killer. The fibers and tire tracks they had been collecting from almost every crime scene were almost exact matches, and the fact that all the victims had been strangled could not be overlooked. As police grew more desperate, they tried upping the stakes, even offering an $11,000 reward for any information that would lead to an arrest. They also kept sending more consistent patrols to University Avenue, where detectives went often to not only question the working girls, but also warn them about what had been happening to women who disappeared. Then finally, a break. Detectives receive a phone call from someone nearly 2,000 miles away in the state of Wisconsin. The informant claimed to have knowledge regarding a long-haul trucker that lived in their area but frequently completed runs to Southern California. As soon as detectives hear the words long-haul trucker, they jump into the lead feet first, already convinced that this is the type of person they were dealing with. Several detectives immediately book flights out to the Midwest to see if they can find out more. But almost immediately after they left, another body was discovered, forcing them to return from their trip when they realized that the man currently in Wisconsin couldn't have been responsible for the murder that had just taken place only hours before. Turning tail, they fly back to California. April 8th, 1991. Another body is found, and this time it is 24-year-old Michelle Sherry Pacer. The part-time maid and sex worker had been found by a transient as he searched through dumpsters and trash cans for anything useful. Michelle, or Sherry, had been left in a flower bed next to a bowling alley parking lot. She was naked when discovered, and a toilet plunger was protruding from her vagina. Sherry had obviously been strangled and stabbed just like the many other victims, but as soon as investigators begin to collect evidence, the building's sprinkler system for the landscaping turns on and begins to spray the entire crime scene. Because of this, much of the valuable possible evidence is just washed away. But, despite not being able to collect much, if any, evidence from the scene, detectives felt as if the newest murder was a message directly to them. It had been printed in the local paper that they were leaving the state to follow a tip, and they felt as if the killer, angry that someone else might steal his spotlight, had struck again just to prove he was still in control. The bodies just kept showing up with what felt like almost no time in between. The locals were not unaware of what was happening around them. As the victim count grew into double figures, community outrage began to grow as well. Letters to the editor, more to the police station, and some people even voicing their concerns at local community meetings. Soon, even national media stations began to report on the murders, and at one point, the case was even featured on America's Most Wanted. Not long after Sherry Pacer was discovered, Detective Bob Creed went on TV to try and defend accusations that the police were dragging their feet because of the profession of the women who were found. Quote, "We don't care if they're drug addicts or prostitutes. They're getting the same resource level as if they were cheerleaders." End quote. Chapter 8. Although not directly employed by police because he occasionally assisted them with acquisitions for equipment, Bill Suff considered himself somewhat of an unofficial peacekeeper. He wore a semi-official looking jacket full of patches and even a shiny looking badge, and was known to, quote, keep an eye out, unquote, over his neighborhood, and was regularly seen in his jacket making his rounds. But what most people didn't know was that every once in a while, Bill took his imaginary role as peacekeeper a little too seriously. As he saw it, if the police weren't going to clean up the streets, if they weren't going to combat the drugs and prostitution that was running rampant in the area, then he would just have to do it himself. July 4th, 1991. A group enjoying a picnic near Railroad Canyon Road has their day come to an abrupt end when they discover the body of 37-year-old Sherry Ann Latham, who had been known to work on Main Street in Lake Elsinore. When found, her hand was still wrapped around a nearby branch, suggesting that she might have been alive when the killer left. By all appearances, it looked like she was trying to crawl to safety. During the autopsy, several cat hairs were discovered on her body, and according to those who knew her, Sherry did not own a cat. It was then surmised that maybe her killer did. Three weeks after the murder of Sherry Latham, Bill becomes a father yet again to a new daughter. Also during this time, one investigator working the case begins to take a photo around to all the local shoe stores. The same footprint had been found at multiple crime scenes, and investigators were looking for just about anything they could use to possibly identify the perpetrator. After visiting more than one store, the investigator found a possible match to a pair of tennis shoes identified as Pro Wings, a pair of shoes that Bill owned and wore often. August 15th, 1991, 10 p.m. Bill is out cruising. Soon he spots his next victim, a woman named Kelly Whitecloud. After a bit of bargaining, a deal is struck for $20, and Kelly climbs into Bill's van. Their first stop, McDonald's for some food. As Kelly eats, Bill begins to drive towards some orchards he knows that are empty at this time of night. Upon finding out the destination, Kelly becomes angry, saying she doesn't want to spend that much time in the van, complaining that it's just too far away and she'd rather stay somewhere closer. In fact, she even has a room they can use, a room with a bed. Bill just ignores her arguments and pleas, remaining adamant about the location, and what's more, he is now only going to pay $10 because he paid for her food. Slowing down to make a turn, Bill is startled when the woman he had just fed jumps out of his van and begins to run. Kelly runs all the way back to University Avenue and arrives just in time to see a friend of hers, Kelly Hammond, climb into the same van that she just escaped from. She tried to chase the van down, tried screaming her friend's name, but it was already too late. Kelly Hammond is found dead the next day on August 16, 1991, in an alleyway near the intersection of Sampson Avenue and Delilah Street in the city of Corona, California. She had been posed where she lay, and the cause of death was ruled as strangulation, along with acute opiate intoxication also contributing. Kelly had lacerations to her forehead, her cheeks, as well as lacerations to her wrists consistent with restraints. According to reports, when she was discovered, her body was still warm. Chapter 9. After the discovery of Kelly Hammond, investigators once again sweep through University Avenue, asking questions to anyone who will talk to them. When questioning Kelly Whitecloud, she tells detectives her story about the man who tried to take her to the grapefruit orchards against her will. She agrees to meet with a sketch artist, and the first drawing of the suspect is created. She is also able to give a description of the vehicle type, a van, as well as the color, silver. Taking this information back to their superior, investigators also comment on how, so far, for some reason, none of the victims up to this point had been black. During his very next meeting with the press, the chief passes this information along, and it's immediately taken to print. September 13th, 1991. Catherine McDonald is found strangled and stabbed to death by a construction worker on a deserted building site near Tuscany Hills, California. And Catherine is black. It felt as if the killer had done it on purpose, like he was once again reminding them who was in charge. Catherine worked on University Avenue and had last been seen on September 12th when she left the apartment she shared with her daughter. Catherine had been strangled to death before being stabbed multiple times with a knife. Her right breast had been removed. It was never discovered. Catherine's body, like others, had been posed with her knees spread apart, her feet pressed together, and her arms extended outward from her body. The very same day Catherine was found, officers requisitioning equipment from the county building receive a page and ask the nearest dock worker, Bill Suff, if they can use a phone. Always happy to help, Bill shows them to the nearest landline and then hovers in the background as investigators take notes and are brought up to date on the newest development. Bill's family life at this point is beginning to fall apart. Cheryl is threatening to leave because he is not only abusive to her, but also their child. Bill, most likely finding her as good cover, begs her to not leave, promising he can change, promising he can get better if she just stays. She believes him, and as a sign of her renewed interest, she buys Bill a gift. A new pair of Converse tennis shoes. 7 weeks later, on October 30th, 1991, 35-year-old Delilah Zamora, aka Delilah Wallace, is found murdered when a man spots her body on the shoulder of the road as he drives along Summerhill Drive. Quote, "At first I thought it was a mannequin, but at closer inspection, I realized it was the corpse of a woman." End quote. Delilah, a mother of 5, worked on University Avenue and had been found strangled to death. 2 months later, in early November, Bill gave a blue denim Levi purse to his wife Cheryl, telling her that his boss had found it, but Cheryl didn't want the purse. Bill went next door to his neighbor Vivian Swanson's house, where he tried to give the purse to her instead. Bill, feeling extra generous, also threw in a gold bracelet that he claimed that his wife no longer wanted. That purse, the bracelet, and 2 rings that his wife ended up keeping all belonged to Zamora. Turns out Bill was not only a murderer, but a thief as well. Chapter 10, December 23rd, 1991. 39-year-old Eleanor Ojeda Casares worked on University Avenue in Riverside, California. She was last heard from that morning when she talked to her sister. In the middle of the day, at approximately 1 p.m., her nude body was found near Victoria Avenue in a grove of orange trees. The cause of death? Strangulation. There were also stab wounds to her chest that would have been fatal had she been alive when they were made. Like Cheryl Coker and Catherine McDonald before her, her right breast had been removed post-mortem and was found approximately 40 feet away from her body. Hairs from both a human and a cat were recovered from her body as well and bagged. Fibers, shoe impressions, and tire marks were also noted and saved. Finally, there was also the fact that the dump site, the orange grove where Eleanor was found, sat just down the street from the Riverside police station. The killer was taunting them. In response to the perceived slight of the body basically being dumped on their doorstep, police double down on their hunt for the killer and Operation Apprehension is launched. If any vehicle that even remotely resembled the vehicle described by Kelly Whitecloud was seen by officers, it was immediately pulled over. If the driver looked even the smallest bit like the sketch that had also come from Kelly, anyone who came into contact with a potential suspect were to immediately call detectives working on the case. January 9th, 1992. A police motorcyclist by the name of Frank Orta was working University Avenue at approximately 9:30 p.m. when he spotted a silver van park in front of a liquor store. He began to watch it. It hadn't been parked there long when a local working girl approached the van, but as she approached, she noticed Officer Orta and quickly turned back around, returning the same way she had come. A minute later, the van began to move. Officer Orta followed. He observed as the silver van came to a complete stop at a red light, where the van was, quote, positioned to go straight in the lane and Then the van suddenly made a right turn without any kind of signal or without moving over towards the curb, end quote. Because of this, Officer Orta pulls the van over for failure to signal a turn. When asked, the driver immediately produced a driver's license, but claimed that he did not have the vehicle's registration. Officer Orta first checked the name on the card, which read Bill Lee Suff. He tried to read the address, but it had been scratched out. Looking back up at the man's face, Officer Orta thought that he definitely bore a strong resemblance to the sketch that had been recirculated around the precinct. He then asked the driver for his current address before returning to his motorcycle in order to write a citation for the moving infraction. Officer Orta radioed dispatch to confirm the status of Bill Suff's driver's license, as well as to determine the status of the van's registration. When dispatch finally responded to the inquiry, they informed Officer Orta that the registration had been expired for over a year. Based on this information, Officer Orta decided to impound the vehicle, immediately calling for backup. A few minutes later, Officers Dwayne Beckman and Don Tuili arrived at Officer Orta's location to help inventory the van before it was taken to the impound lot. Among the items collected were wire-rimmed glasses, a parole card with Bill Suff's name on it, a black notebook, blankets, and numerous pieces of cord. When asked about the card, Bill told officers that, yes, he had been on parole for a crime he had committed in the state of Texas. Then Officer Tuili found a firearm in a holster, and because Bill was a suspected felon, he was immediately arrested. But upon further investigation, the firearm turned out to be a pellet gun, something a felon was well within their rights to possess. They were just about to take off the cuffs when they found a knife, a fixed blade knife, something a convicted felon is prohibited from having in his possession. As Officer Beckman continued to examine the knife he had just found, he noticed what appeared to be dried blood on the blade. With this information, and with how much the man in the van matched the sketches of the suspected serial killer, Officer Tuili calls dispatch once again and gets a hold of Detective Christine Kears, one of the detectives working on the strangulation murders. Detective Kears immediately asks the officer to check the tire on the front driver's side. He responds that it's a Yokohama 371. She immediately tells him to secure the seat. 20 minutes later, detectives arrive on scene and make note of the rest of the tires as well as the defendant's shoes. They ask if they can search the van, and Bill says yes. Inside, they find items that could possibly have been the sources of fibers found on many, if not all, of the victims. Bill Suff is then read his rights and transported to the Riverside Police Station for further questioning. Chapter 11. Bill was described by the detectives who questioned him as a regular-looking, everyday guy. The soft-spoken man remained completely calm as he was questioned. He smiled, joked around, and cooperated with just about everything. He just didn't look like or act like a monster who could have brutalized so many women in such a short period of time. Bill continued to hold up the charade, that is, until they began to question him about the latest victim discovered by police, Eleanor Casares. Using not only the tires on his van, but the width between them as well, detectives told Bill that they knew for a fact that his van had recently been in the orange groves. As soon as the words, groves, left their lips, Bill changed. Now nervous, Bill begins to give a story about how he occasionally does visit the groves on his way to work in the mornings, but this last time, instead of finding breakfast, he found a body. He says that he merely got out of his van, went and checked on the woman, and that's when he found the knife. Yes, he did take the knife, the one that was in his car. He had in fact pulled it out of her body, but she was already dead. Bill is rambling now, and investigators are just letting him fill the silence with his continuous string of words. I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything to her after I found her. It wasn't me that cut her breast off. Bill just kept talking himself deeper and deeper into a hole, and investigators let him. Warrants were then issued for Bill Suff's apartment and place of work, where a plethora of evidence along with souvenirs were found. Various belongings from at least 3 of the murdered women, including jewelry found in his wife's jewelry box, were removed from his home. They also found clothing, purses, and other items, all taken from the victims' dead bodies. Detectives then discovered 2 pairs of men's shoes that matched prints found from more than one crime scene, as well as multiple General Electric Miser 95-watt light bulbs, the same kind of bulb that was found inside of Tina Leal. There was also a pair of shoes that had been stolen off of the dead body of Tina Leal, complete with one of her hairs still inside. When talking to people who knew Bill, they also tracked down a sweater given away by Bill that he had stolen from Eleanor Casares, as well as jeans of hers he had given to one of his neighbors. Moving their focus to Bill's place of work, they made more discoveries. In a box on a shelf at the warehouse Bill worked at was a purse and ID of Catherine McDonald. On another shelf, they found citations for prostitution and drug offenses issued to Delilah Zamora, earrings that also belonged to Delilah, and the ID card of Eleanor Casares. Last but not least, Bill's car was searched with a fine-tooth comb. Inside was the knife with Eleanor Casares' blood, a notice to appear form that had been issued to Kelly Hammond, and cat hair that appeared to be similar to cat hair found on the bodies of multiple of the murdered women. Fibers are taken from Bill's car as well as items in the car, and match after match is made to the fibers found all over the victims, including Susan Sternfeld, Kelly Hammond, Catherine McDonald, Delilah Zamora, and Eleanor Casares. There were gray carpet fibers from the van's carpet, fibers from the van's side panel upholstery, as well as fibers from the seats. Other fibers found at the various scenes also included fibers from a sleeping bag that was inside of Bill's van. There were blue nylon fibers from the exterior of the bag, as well as red fibers from the bag's lining, and even white nylon fibers that matched the insulation. There were also fibers on many of the victims that matched the rope found in Bill's van. Then there was the hair. It was literally everywhere. Hair that was identified by an expert as most likely coming from Bill's head and or pubic areas was found on Tina Leal, Darla Ferguson, Carol Miller, Cheryl Coker, Catherine McDonald, and Eleanor Casares. Hairs from multiple victims were also found inside of Bill's van. They also took DNA samples from Bill and sent them off for analysis. There were 9 separate matches. Chapter 12. Because Bill was on parole when he was arrested, investigators could take their time getting their case together, and 3 years later, on March 25th, 1995, at the Riverside Hall of Justice, the trial officially began. Bill had been charged with the murders of 13 different women, though he was suspected to have been the perpetrator in even more cases. 271 different witnesses were called, and over 1,000 pieces of evidence were submitted. During the months-long trial, it was noted by many present in the court that Bill had little to no empathy. He watched with no emotion as Bonnie Ashley testified that yes, she had let Bill drive her station wagon, the same one used to pick up Rhonda Jetmore. He sat still as Rhonda Jetmore herself, a woman who had picked his photo out of a lineup of 6, was sworn in and testified that she had absolutely no doubt that the defendant was the man who tried to kill her. He sat behind the defense table, completely stone-faced, as he tried to convince the judge as well as the jury that despite all the testimony, despite all the evidence, he was innocent. Bill claimed that he was just a patsy, a fall man for an inept police department that couldn't be bothered to find the real killer, the real monster. Even his 2 lawyers, Randolph K. Diggs and Frank S. Peasley, both described Bill as an easygoing man who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. But on July 19th, 1995, a jury convicted William Lester Suff of the first-degree murders of Kimberly Little, Tina Leal, Darla Ferguson, Carol Miller, Cheryl Coker, Susan Sternfield, Kathleen Milne, Sherry Latham, Kelly Hammond, Catherine McDonald, Delilah Zamora, and Eleanor Casares. Bill is also found guilty on 1 count of attempted murder for his attack on Rhonda Jetmore. For the murder of Michelle Pacer, the jury was unable to make a unanimous decision despite Bill's semen being found in Michelle because there was another man's semen found as well. He is also convicted of use of a deadly weapon as well as lying in wait. On October 10th, 1995, William Bill Suff is sentenced to death 12 times. The question remained though, why had he done it? Why did he kill so many with absolutely zero remorse? His first wife just might have had the semblance of an answer when she said, quote, "I firmly believe he is going to hell. There's too much dark in him." He had a look in his eyes that was just so scary. It was an evil look. I'm basically the one that got away. End quote. There are other women, other murders that Bill is the prime suspect in, and of these the most prominent are Martha Bess Young, a native of New Mexico who was found naked and posed in May of 1987. She had been strangled to death. Michelle Yvette Gutierrez, a newly transplanted individual from Corpus Christi, Texas. She had been strangled and mutilated with the majority of the trauma near her genital areas. Linda May Ruiz had been discovered on the beach of Lake Elsinore. Her head had been buried in the sand, the cause of death, acute asphyxiation. Last was Junie Lynn Angel, a 36-year-old drug addict and prostitute who had been found bludgeoned to death. William Bill Suff is currently on death row in San Quentin Prison, where he still awaits execution. He continues to maintain his innocence. This has been another episode of Almost Fiction, a podcast where we try to imagine what it was like in the moments where some of the worst crimes occurred. Thank you for all of your support. Thank you to those who do their part in keeping the bills paid and the lights on. No amount is too small, and we at 1159 Media really appreciate your contributions. Times are tough, and if money is too tight, it's just as important for us if you can rate and review the show. If you have any questions or comments, you can send them to almostfictionpod@gmail.com. That's almostfictionpod@gmail.com. Once again, thank you for all you do. And a special shout out to all of our listeners in Switzerland. Almost Fiction almost cracked the top 100 true crime podcasts there, and it's all thanks to you. So, danke vielmals. Sorry if I butchered it. And as always, I'm Chase Ellerman, and this is Almost Fiction.